Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and this week we examine delivery progress on the multi-billion pound strategy and pipeline underpinning the UK's ambition to place infrastructure at the heart of economic, social and environmental growth across the nation. Last week, NISTA, the government's National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, published its latest major projects annual report. This document offers a transparent look at the ongoing £924 billion government project portfolio, tracking 189 of the UK's most complex and ambitious initiatives, from nuclear power stations all the way through to digital transformations. Joining me today to dissect these numbers and explain the bold delivery strategy is NISTA's Chief Executive, Becky Wood, who has been at the helm of the organisation since June last year, shortly after it was formed, bringing together the National Infrastructure Commission and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Its role, broadly, is to help drive strategy and improve performance across this huge investment portfolio. Certainly, this report highlights delivery progress, but it also draws a line in the sand ahead of NISTA's radical overhaul known as Project Reset, which in April slashed its central oversight down to just 80 core nationally significant projects and set out to demand sharper accountability and faster delivery. So the question is, how will this renewed focus help turn around the sector's lengthening major infrastructure delivery timelines, and how can NISTA use data and digital systems to salvage failing projects and maximise the value from every pound of the taxpayers' cash? So let's find out. Becky, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I follow in grand footsteps, so it's exciting.
Well, it's great to see you here in the Treasury building. I want to start with the latest major projects annual report and your role in keeping projects on track. But first, NISTA, 15 months old. In your words then, what is it, and what is it doing that the IPA and NIC weren't able to do separately before?
I think it's a really good place to start, actually. So I've had the luxury of being here just over 12 months myself, and NISTA is really forming and coming together in terms of the big foundations of what we need to do. The essence of NISTA, I think, is very much that bringing together actively strategy and delivery. So fantastic work from the National Infrastructure Commission over the years, in particular drawing on lots of the lessons that we saw through their review of the drivers of major costs, actually, in infrastructure. That was about October 2024. But also things like the Infrastructure and Projects Authority leading guidance, thinking about how we could do government project delivery better as clients, and to drive really effective assurance. Bringing those two things together, the magic I think that we've seen, particularly in certain pockets across this year, is how do you use strategic thinking and that broader picture on infrastructure to inform the way we approach delivery right through the project life cycle. So what's really important to me is that we're getting ahead of things somewhat. We're getting upstream, we're having those conversations early. But as you just said, I'm coming to you from the Treasury, and that's been quite a big part of our change, right? So we're coming into that conversation, we're having those discussions about where investment can and should be made and how to get the best value out of investment.
So, I mean, I've said in the past that the move really does, the change is moving from strategy to delivery. Would you say that's a sort of a broad sense of where you are now, right at this particular moment?
I think we're definitely getting there. I don't think I should pretend it's a very straightforward thing to do, because I think perhaps your audience is wiser than I would be in terms of the challenges themselves. I would say, though, what we're seeing is that ability to bring to life things like our Align tool. So that's a spatial planning tool drawing on lots of different data about lots of different flavours of infrastructure at particular geographical locations, and how that should inform where we put our focus and potential challenges as well as opportunities for the projects we build. It's very rare, I think, that really great infrastructure outcomes are about a single sectoral intervention. It's actually about the system coming together. And that's the ethos, I think, of what NISTA needs to be about.
Well, turning to the annual report, your analysis shows great confidence and on-track delivery across what you described as the government's most complex and strategically significant projects. Would you say then that, notwithstanding a few high-profile examples, we're getting better at major project delivery in the UK?
I would absolutely like to say that, because I think we have huge talent across the supply chain, across the government project side.
I feel there's a but coming, Becky. I feel there's a but coming.
I also think, though, that we shouldn't be at all complacent, because the operating environment we're delivering into remains changeable and very challenging, right? It would be foolish not to think about geopolitics, for example, in delivery, because of the fact that our supply chains tend to be very global, as do our people and our capability and the way we move around. So yes, I do think we're getting better. I also quite often talk publicly about the fact I'd love to be an advocate advocate for where we get it really right. We do some great things rather than only focusing on where we've got the most challenge and the need to reset.
Yeah, well, I was just over opposite in the Institution of Civil Engineers, and there was an event by Tideway, and of course, and Tideway is always heralded as a project which is a success. Do we talk about those sort of things enough?
No, I don't think we do, actually. And I'd really like to talk about them more collectively as an industry, partly because some of my job has an international facing aspect to it. I talk to my partner bodies, as you'd expect as an infrastructure body, but I also talk across trade missions and so on, understanding how our global supply chain can use the fantastic outcomes it's driven here and use that across the global market, right? So I do think we can talk about it more, and we should. I also think there's pockets of brilliance that we don't often always talk about or see immediately. In particular, things like the way we have to earn social license for infrastructure. I think that really matters. Sizewell C is doing some great stuff there, for example. Really interesting how Lower Thames Crossing is really transforming its relationship with supply chain in terms of how we decarbonise some of the things that we need to do to get great things built. So fantastic to hear Tideway talked about, but I think we could talk about more.
Well, we saw 26 projects exit the major projects portfolio this year after successfully delivering their objectives. I mean, that number is nearly double the 14 from the year before. So what specific lessons do you take them from those successful exits that can be helped to maybe help some of the more troublesome projects?
I think one of the really big themes we talk about across all the projects we engage with is the fact that the business case can never sit in the drawer, if you'll pardon that sort of rather artificial pun, I suppose. So we cannot have a loss of focus on our strategic outcomes and what we need to do. And I think what that drives is really good behaviours across programmes in understanding when you have to make a trade-off, what is good for programme, what is good for project overall, rather than simply focusing on the immediacy of the tactical challenge that you've got. And actually, we do see the lengthening of projects, and there's a great deal of complexity across NISTA's portfolio and across the government and across actually the UK supply chain. But separately from that, actually taking the pause moment and thinking about, okay, we're in a situation where we've had to build trust, have great relationships, and we're very clear on strategic outcomes. That tends to mean we're going to make the right choices and actually drive the best outcome. Yeah.
Well, you highlight the new mega project classification, tracking multi-parliament programmes like HS2, Sizewell C, and the Dreadnought submarine programme. So how will NISTA ensure that, I mean, given the constant shifting political priorities, and maybe we'll get to that in a moment, but I mean, how do you make sure that over multiple governments, these programmes can be delivered successfully?
I think that's absolutely part of what NISTA's creation was about, actually. The reason we started off by both publishing a 10-year infrastructure strategy and publishing a forward-look pipeline for infrastructure and commitment and investment is because we have to look across the longer term to do this well. I think separately from that, the mega projects concept has a number of different facets to it, as we'd all know, and we've all read it, and well done David Goldstone in getting that published out, right? But what's been really useful for me, frankly, is the connections I can bring between the different mega projects. I think we've made fairly public now that Lower Thames Crossing and small modular reactors are coming into that group now. And the beauty of that is because they're different in terms of project lifestyle, they're different in terms of complexity, but there's some really big thematic things that we need to get right across all of the projects. So governance, accountability, assurance, all those conversations between these powerful leaders in industry help me enhance what we can do and do my job better.
Meanwhile, of course, though, we are set for a change in Prime Minister. With it, the inevitable reshuffle on reshaping of ministerial priorities. Are you bracing, therefore, for change in the infrastructure strategy or in a Burnham government, emphasising devolved power and greater regional investment? How does that look in your world?
Well, as an infrastructure person for 25 more years, I'm actually really excited by the fact that we can be having these place-based conversations. A lot of what NISTA is designed to do is actually bring that to life. I've mentioned the Align tool, our spatial planning tool, but also a lot of this is also using the data that we have to look across geographies, right? We think about capability and capacity gaps. We need to think about where the market is, particularly for SMEs, and how locally we can bring that to life. But that is actually all about geographies and place. The other thing is, I mentioned the business case. Strategic outcomes that we need to achieve from infrastructure really need to be informed by the infrastructure's users, the people that this infrastructure is designed to serve. So I think that's really exciting. However, I am also colloquially the sort of chief infrastructure nerd for government, right? So I'm going to repeat the lessons that we know that we have huge evidence in relation to, which is this is about a system as a whole, and it is about long term. So, keeping the ship steady, holding to the strategic outline that we've got, and thinking about that framing out into the future, I think is really important to drive the great economic growth outcomes that people want.
Well, chief infrastructure nerd, that's not a bad title. Well, it may stick, who knows? But those numbers though, and just drilling into some of those numbers, because those are numbers that you've published in your annual report, are the kind of numbers which I'm sure that Andy Byrne's team will be looking at. And when you look into those, let's talk about project duration. The numbers do reveal a stark trend in the overall average project duration. And that's climbed from 11.1 to 13.2 years. And more significantly, in infrastructure and construction, it's spiked by nearly 4 years. We're seeing an average of 14.8 years for infrastructure projects. Why are these projects still taking so much longer to realise? And is there a risk that, this 15-year delivery timeline, means ultimately we're investing in stuff which is just not relevant anymore when it's built?
I think that's a really wise thing to be looking at, actually, particularly say, for example, if we talk about obsolescence, huge amounts of our infrastructure, fantastic respect for the civils, as you know, I'm a fellow. But a lot of this is about systems, right? It's about the smart nature of things. It's about the digital nature of things. So we need to be keeping up with that in terms of the way we build and what we're building for and how we anticipate the future, right? We've seen some great things from the flood defence programme. Regrettably, in terms of resilience of our asset base, that's an area that draws my eye a lot, because we need to think about the future of the build. But I think also when we look at the longevity of projects and we look at the overall life cycle, some of the really important interventions we need to continue to make are championing things like planning reform, right? So there's been great intent there. I think we're seeing movement. But the reason that's so important is because we cannot take such a lengthy period to make some of these decisions and then sort of crash into delivery, right? We have to plan wisely. I'm a big advocate of investing time in the earlier phases, the development, the design, to get this right. And only really through that can you accelerate the delivery end, right? But there's different slices of why this is taking us perhaps arguably a bit longer than it should.
So 11 years or 14 years or 15 years is too long. What you're also saying is there's a minimum as well, because you have to do that planning up front.
Yeah, and I'm a strong believer that you shouldn't rush that phase, because we see this writ large all over many of the projects that we've learned painful lessons about. The flip side being, when I talk about planning, I'm not talking about capital P planning necessarily. I'm talking about the fact we have to develop schemes thoughtfully. We have to understand what we're driving at. I think that might circle back to the long-term point as well. For our infrastructure to have real longevity of value, we have to be able to really sharply frame, why are we doing this? What it's about? Who is it for? What's the intention? And outcomes being framed well is a difficult thing to do, but I think it's even more important.
Yeah, making sure that the people that you're impacting, that you're helping, actually get a say is a very important part of it.
Agree.
And it takes time. Talk about whole life costs as well, because other numbers in there I'm sure will catch the eye of an incoming Prime Minister. Infrastructure and construction specifically, the average cost is now 6.7 billion and rising. How much of this rise is driven by systemic inflation versus perhaps poor initial scoping by departments?
I think there's a real blend of reasons for it, if I'm fairly frank. There is a little bit of that, come on, let's get it right up front to avoid some of this. I think the other thing is a lot of the principles of Project Reset, which you've mentioned, is about streamlining decision making. So the additional layering of decision making doesn't necessarily add value. We have to be really careful about the way we're governing things, the way we're planning for decisions, and how we understand the way decisions should be made. The reason I mention that is because unless we can streamline decision making, we are actually at risk of importing further delay, and that's simply because we need to govern ourselves and hold ourselves to account that we need to push this forward, or indeed make a difficult choice earlier.
Yeah. So of course, building new stuff is a really important part of your role, but there's a huge amount of work and investment needed to actually keep existing infrastructure going, the whole management of assets. How does NISTA get involved in that side of it?
Well, lots of people know I love to reference pages 87 and 93 of the infrastructure strategy, because they talk about the social infrastructure roadmap and they talk about asset maintenance and how important those budgets are, going well beyond the social infrastructure estate. I think there's a really critical role for NISTA to play. It's another example of where we've lent into some of the work that the Treasury is doing from a value for money perspective on asset maintenance. But my personal view is we need to go beyond that. We've talked about digital data. We've talked about tools that we can use to think about things. Resilience is really important. So we can't just maintain. We need to renew and look to the future and keep keeping that balance of investment and thinking about that sort of drumbeat of commitment to maintenance and renewal and resilience factors around our existing asset base has to be part of the conversation for the longer term, I think.
Well, we're living through it right now. I mean, anyone who's got a train recently is very aware of the fact that the tracks are getting very, very hot. Similarly with water supplies, etc., and that is only going to get more of a pressing issue.
Absolutely needs to be part of the conversation. We've been giving evidence recently as NISTA about asset resilience, and we've been learning a lot and listening again to industry and to academia on this point. It mustn't we mustn't lose sight of it.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the overarching 10-year strategy, but before that, let's talk about Project Reset. Because you say this move represents a massive philosophical shift, a move away from central portfolio to a hyper-focused model of where you analyse the projects. But the report notes that prior to your programme Reset in April, the portfolio held 34 red-rated projects, which was up from 31 the previous year. I mean, given that red rating means, it triggers a deeper, more targeted support. I mean, how much of the Project Reset was born out of, I suppose, an honest admission that you just simply don't have the resources here to track 189 highly complex projects?
I think there's an element of the targeting and the focusing which needs to be informed on what the most in need of that focus are. So, and that can be through a different set of different lenses, if you will, right? So obviously we have a look at cost, scale, complexity. We also think about the environment in which this project is being delivered. So this sort of operating environment, if you will, is this a once in a kind for this particular agency or department? Yeah. Or is this a sort of regular steady state? Actually, they have a huge capital department themselves, and they're very, very highly tooled up to do it.
In which case they can look after it themselves.
Exactly right. I think there's a bit of targeting and focus, if I'm honest. I don't have unlimited resourcing. That would be not appropriate for the taxpayer. Yeah. So I've got to be thoughtful about how I prioritise my time and our effort collectively at centre. I think the other thing is the power of digital data is really important to me. So lots of the work that the Infrastructure and Projects Authority were doing, lots of the thinking around guidance like the Teal book, the things that we need to put out through the project delivery profession are about making sure that you have the right things you can draw on so that you can apply them in the project space. Yeah. The other thing is the way we use data. So I'm hoping people will see our continued use of, increasingly intelligent digital data as part of this, right? We're not withdrawing tracking or support for departments, but we are being a bit more thoughtful about the way we share the insights back from that data. So we're developing a few AI tools in that space, as people would expect, and being really thoughtful about what we're seeing as early indications. Mm-hmm. The other thing is it allows me to have quite a useful, I think, and productive conversation with accountable officers. I'm not actually technically accountable for delivery of any of these projects. There's huge talent and capability at different levels of governance across the government landscape here. So how we bring the power of those shareholder representatives and non-executives, for example, into the level 2 assurance space, if you will, is part of the conversation of how we make sure that projects are geared up for success.
Why 80 projects? How do you come to that number? Is it just...
It's actually a range, which, as you'd expect as a project professional, I'm quite comfortable with. So we've talked about the fact it should be between 80 and 100. Actually, the number's already moving around, just to be completely transparent. Okay. The reason for that is because we're using those criteria I mentioned. We're thinking about the scale of these things. We're thinking about complexity, but we're also making an assessment of where we're best placed to support.
Yeah. So, by reducing the size of your portfolio, you've had a significant accountability back to these individual departments. I mean, what are the guarantees, or what gives you the confidence that they are mature enough to handle this burden without letting maybe some of these failures go undetected?
I mean, accountability actually has always lain with the departments. And part of this is very useful conversation to make sure that's really clear, right? Roles and responsibilities matter. We know that. But separately, we're not seeing this as an immediate sort of withdrawal. We're not sort of vanishing into another room, as it were. I have some really live and useful conversations across the Permanent Secretaries Group, for example, about governance and accountability, about assurance design, and about how we can make sure that that capability factor is there. The talent pipeline across government project delivery is really important to me.
Right. Let's talk a bit about you, Becky. You're just over a year into this role. How would you describe your evolving vision for NISTA then?
I think it's been a fantastic year of building some foundations. I always want to thank my people for bearing with it because, as we know, making changes to organisations can be really quite painful.
And there's been a lot of change by the sound of it.
There's quite a huge amount of change, yes. I'm really delighted actually that we have our sort of functional structure now in play. So we have a director of strategy and systems change. We have a director of market and sector engagement. We have directors holding our portfolio role and our assurance role. We have a director holding delivery, and we have a director holding project finance. So that's starting to settle in terms of that breadth of role we need to take. In terms of how we keep our eye on the prize, I think what's really important to me is those sort of three primary messages, right? Long term does matter across our sector. So looking out to the strategic and thinking about that, drawing on people like my chair, the Expert Advisory Council for NISTA. We have a chair, we have members there.
That's Julia Prescott.
Yes, using Julia to sort of hold me to account, right, on my strategic horizon and how I'm championing that. And then really getting into the data, right? We've got a fantastic pipeline. We're seeing some emergent good things from jobs and skills outputs from that, from the investable pipeline characteristics. But we have to keep a focus on that and how we do it. And then I think the third thing is making this a great place to work, not to sound too naff, because we need great talent. We're a small organisation in the centre. We have to be massively collaborative, and we want to partner with industry, so looking at secondments and so on. So keeping us sort of live to that.
You mentioned your new director of market engagement. Has that been announced yet?
Market and sector engagement, yes. We have been talking about that internally to government. He hasn't quite joined us. He's arriving in August.
Okay, right. So I thought maybe you were going to give me a slight scoop there, but not quite there yet. Okay, right. Go back to you then. You were a partner and sustainable infrastructure leader at EY before joining NISTA. But of course, this is not your first public sector role. How would you describe the cultural differences between the public and the private sector right now? Because arguably that's one of the main things you're trying to do at NISTA.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bring those two together.
That is spot on. And that theory that partnering really effectively has to be central. It's not just a theory, it's a business reality, right? Around 80% or so of our projects are actually bought, built and delivered through private sector colleagues, right? So we need to be really thoughtful about that. I mean, I would say culturally, actually, I might think of us as a sector rather than public and private sectors separately. And I mean, infrastructure. We generally, I think, are people who are interested in addressing complex challenges and doing fantastic things which then move the dial, they shift things, they make a difference. I think in terms of the way that we can work at speed and the navigation of the system, my experience of both the private and public sector means you do have to understand the machine, if you will. You need to understand how we work, right? I've worked in a partnership before, I've worked in an owner-owned business in the private sector, as well as in the public sector in Australia and here in the UK. So understanding those relationships and the way that we're structured really matters. And sometimes there's value, I think, in trying to explain that to each other, right? Because we're differently wired as systems. The way we make decisions, the sorts of risks that we might be worried about will have slightly different characteristics. So a bit of translation factor, I think, is really powerful. That's partly why I mentioned secondments, actually, because I think getting used to each other is a really important part of partnering and building trust, right? I think the other thing is a preparedness to listen. So as the public sector, we are, quite often scrutinised heavily, as is quite right and proper. I spend your money, I spend my money, I spend taxpayers' money, right? That's hugely important to be scrutinised in that way. But I think it's important for us at sort of leadership level to be open to the new and to be curious and to demonstrate a degree of appetite to think about risk differently and to propose things that might be a little novel and different. And that can be, I think, quite a challenge when you're in a far more structured or deeply historical sort of set of contexts.
I suppose also to understand that the private sector, it has to make a profit out of what it's doing.
Yes, and that's absolutely how they pay people's wages, right? Exactly. And jobs, skills and employment are pretty good for growth.
You worked for 11 years at the DfT, overseeing a range of high-profile projects such as HS2, Crossrail and the 2012 Olympics, and as head of London delivery. How do you reflect on those times in terms of the ability maybe to get things done compared to today? Is it harder today to do those major projects?
I think a lot of the jobs that I had in the DfT were quite sort of single focus, and I don't mean in any way to suggest they weren't complex, right? I was the SRO for Crossrail for 8 years, which is a huge endeavour, right, with thousands of people doing brilliant work on it. But sometimes walking into a room and being the representative for that one thing, understanding those outcomes that you need to achieve for that particular purpose, I think is really, really helpful in being able to sort of drive home what you're trying to achieve. A lot of the work we've done for NISTA, I think, has been synthesising a little bit. What do we mean by system change? What are our areas of focus? What are the key priorities? Because that's quite tricky if you've got a really broad remit. I would say the reflection coming back in as well is it's hugely useful, I think, for me to have had the luxury of working sort of up and down the project life cycle, right? One of my first jobs of government was to lead the negotiations with Europe at that time, with the European Commission, but also with banks about the collapse of the PPP on the Tube, Metronet. And it's a very salutary way to start things when you understand that things have gone regrettably very awry. So there's a great advantage in that, in terms of reflecting on those lessons and thinking about that when you then start something up, right? So I've got quite a breadth of that sort of project lifecycle stuff, being involved in things like the Paralympics, in that design set of conversations we were having about the fact that the status quo for the way that people were experiencing the games from the perspective of different forms of mobility impairment and so on didn't actually have to be the status quo. And the license we had with the games behind us to do things differently, I think it's really educational. The other side of that, I think, is also the fact that when we're in these rooms, there's a huge amount of passion. That's a really consistent thing. We come back, you see people across my teams, across the teams I work with in government, they really care. And that's a great thing to unlock. The flip side being, when you're doing broader things and you're doing new things, you do have to take that little bit of risk, right? And I have to be able to sort of lead that, own it, be accountable for it, and, you know, take it when it doesn't quite work out.
Well, they say a lot of those projects that I mentioned there, I imagine you've got quite a few scars to prove that you were there. So, but you also worked in Sydney for 6 years, as you mentioned earlier, for Transport for New South Wales and then Oricon. Would you say, or how would you say the Australian project delivery compares to that in the UK?
Well, I think I had the great fortune of working on quite a lot of different projects, some of which went swimmingly, others of which not quite so, right? So interestingly, you know, always a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's quite an interesting thing to work in a state and federal system. So you tend to have great proximity, perhaps, to, you know, individual cabinet ministers or the cabinet itself at state level. And then you're also navigating the sort of federal discussion about how your funding works. There's a bit of an interesting change in the system, right? I was given a huge amount of license because I was in a delivery agency to go out and get quite a few things bought and built, and that was a gift. But the projects I worked on were slightly shorter in terms of project life cycle. So again, fantastic for me to see it stood up and got into the market and then into service. That's a gift for someone like me in terms of understanding that and seeing it happen. I think the other reflection would be, again, there's a thematic thing for us as an infrastructure gang, right? Where we're really interested by each other's experiences. We want to see what's working well. We had some great alliancing, for example, in some of the projects I worked on in Australia. I'm always very interested by commercial models and how they drive outcomes. But we're also very happy to be fairly open with each other when things aren't going beautifully. So that's built some fantastic connections for me. I love to work with Infrastructure Australia, and I know Tim Reardon, the Infrastructure Commissioner over there, very well from my past. And that willingness across the oceans to keep talking, I think it's great.
Well, certainly through the work I do with the Transforming Infrastructure Performance programme, and we constantly talk about the cross-fertilisation of ideas between Australia and the UK, and between Australia and the US, and the US and the UK as well. There's a lot of cross-fertilisation that's going on, which is great. How do you unwind that? You're now back in the UK. How do you unwind from the major projects delivery challenges? You've got a family?
I have got a family, and we have a fantastic dog who is very wonderful, but a bit daft.
All right, so we'll have to ask what sort of dog?
Is quite fun. She's a rescue. She's mainly Staffy.
Right, okay, fine.
She's a rescue dog. So I love to take her out and sort of see what she's going to do next. She's quite unpredictable, to be honest. But I love to swim. So you can sort of take the women away from Australia, right? But you can kind of, you know, that sea swimming stuff. I don't do quite as much of that, albeit the current weather means I probably could. But I do quite a lot of swimming still, and I love to do that.
Chosen location for swimming in the UK then?
Well, usually locally it's in a fairly sort of unglamorous swimming pool, actually.
Oh, right, okay.
But when I can get out in the UK, I love to go to the Witterings. That's a lovely place to swim.
Very good. Well, as they might say, it's a little less sharky.
Yes, there's probably lower risk, albeit, you know, you never know in Cornwall these days, right?
Exactly, yeah. Well, just getting back to infrastructure, let's talk about the 10-year infrastructure strategy. I mean, it seems that across many metrics, infrastructure projects and programs, you know, do compare poorly to some of the other major projects in your portfolio. I mean, how do you see the UK government's 10-year infrastructure strategy really changing that and start to see our infrastructure programs performing perhaps as well as some of those other government programs?
I think it's really important that we, as I say, sort of stick to that long-term lens, right?
Yeah.
I really advocate for that, and, you know, I get lots of international support from my counterparts that, you know, we're starting with 10 years, why not extend it, right? But there's also quite a bit, I think, about understanding those different system interventions. So the strategy is quite wide-ranging. We talk about quite a lot of different things. I'm very passionate about how we bring to life things like bringing those themes out on economic regulatory reform, for example. There are barriers there necessarily, I think, to delivery. We've had some great reports from, Corrie, Cunliffe, Ingleton.
Yeah.
How do we synthesise that and actually make sure that we are making the change and reflecting on that? There's broader planning reforms, which clearly we're very cited on and involved with supporting, seeing come to life, things like lead environmental regulators, for example, and how does that help us deliver infrastructure? If you then narrow it down to sort of how we're going to do this differently, we've talked a bit about reset.
Yeah.
There's also that conversation about private financing, right? So quite a lot of my teams are very close to things like Lower Thames Crossing, to Euston, to neighbourhood healthcare PPPs, and to public sector estate decarbonisation PPPs, because we want to see those models working.
Yeah,
we
well,
need
they have
that
to work.
investment, we need that efficiency coming through. So there's quite a span, I think, of opportunity for us to make those interventions and make change.
Because the 10-year strategy is backed by a commitment of at least 750 billion, alongside an extra 120 billion in growth driving capital. But there's a whole load of private money that's required to get into there. With such unprecedented capital investment, how do you see NISTA really tying this fundamentally into the government's core mission of raising living standards? And driving growth across it, because that's fundamentally what the government's trying to do. It's investing for a reason.
To make things better.
Yes,
absolutely. To make things better. And certainly lots of us, I think, in the industry, but speaking personally for myself, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have taken this job. I wouldn't have come back to government if I didn't think that's what it needed to be all about in terms of the people that this infrastructure needs to serve better, right? So I think there's quite a lot about that £725 billion. That's a floor, if you will. That's a sort of at least £725 billion worth of public capital over the next 10 years. But then when you get into things like our dynamic infrastructure pipeline, the blend of numbers in there is slightly different, and there's a different sort of lens in terms of 5 to 10 years, the nature of commitments, and that includes elements of private investment and public-private, right? So perhaps we're looking at regulated investments as well as public. So there's a huge need to be flexible and look across that. Within the where do we get the really good stuff happening? Part of the reason we're focusing in particular on, say, the pipeline, on those sort of two different lenses. One of them is job skills and capability, and how we make sure that this data gets to the granularity it needs to understand how we're getting people into our industry, how we're understanding the jobs and skills potential, and we're making sure it's happening. The other thing is about that investable pipeline. So working with people like public financial institutions to bring that to life. We must bring this in, and we must be investing in great things at local level. Yeah.
Well, the Chief Secretary to the Treasurer recently highlighted the DCO development consent order for the Lower Thames Crossing as a tangible example of, what, to quote, what building again looks like. Beyond this specific milestone, how are the broader pro-growth planning reforms that are coming out of the government, or certainly the messages coming out of government, how are they fundamentally altering the delivery pace that you're seeing?
I think we need to see more, if I'm honest. I think we're seeing the emergent stuff, and I think we need to keep championing the changes and seeing them come to life, because they're relatively emergent. I think what's been brilliant, actually, is to see a willingness to really push at change. Yeah. We now are getting this stuff as an opportunity, right? So things like the lead environmental regulator, as I mentioned, I think that can have a really good impact. We're beginning to see the glimmering of it. I think that's great. I think the other thing is part of that work with people like the public financial institutions and with colleagues across infrastructure where they're wanting to invest is helping them translate opportunity, right? So we've made some changes. Let's think about where this could really come to bear and where you can get through the process faster.
Yeah, well, there's some difficult stuff. Talk about nine new reservoirs, for instance, electricity grid connections, all of which potentially in the long term will have great benefits for the public, but in the short term, massive impacts, massive challenges in terms of making that case. Are we better at making those cases?
I think we could definitely keep improving. And the reason I say that is because I think in my mind, there's quite a difference between social value and social license. I'm a very strong sort of proponent, and we've been working with a lot of our colleagues on how social value needs to come to life and how we're procuring that well and effectively. But when you go out and about on the project, sort of, ride the route, so you get out on the asset site and so on the build sites, some of this actually really is about very proactive and not scientific, but really thoughtful engagement of the local community. Horribly enough, lots of the things we do are about to be quite disruptive usually when we're coming in. Where that's done really thoughtfully and we've really actually understood what communities are interested by and needed rather than walking in and assuming, I actually think that has huge buyback. It's fantastic to be, say, for example, in Clyde recently, working with colleagues on Dreadnought, or looking at things that are happening in Barrow and how we can see some adjacencies coming out, right? Yeah. Jobs and skills mean really important
those
pathways.
Projects make a tangible impact on the local
having
community.
Adjacency of higher educational institutions, having adjacency of trades and training. We need welders, we know it, so let's put some training in.
And you see that at Sizewell C, of course, where they're building colleges around there and they're really engaging the community. The pipeline, though, the latest iteration of the infrastructure pipeline promises to give investors and supply chains a really granular look at workforce demand and procurement status. Given the historic market volatility, how reliable or can this be for the private sector, to use the NISTA data, to make those capital and hiring investment decisions? Because right now, getting those wrong, it could be business critical.
It's hugely meaningful, particularly because, of course, we can't talk generically about the industry, right? The supply chain is composed of many, many different shapes and sizes of organisation. Particularly, I want us to be very thoughtful about small and medium enterprises, for example, where, risk factors and sort of vulnerabilities might differ, right? Yeah. So it's really important to us that it is a committed set of projects, and that's why the numbers look slightly different in colour in terms of, where the numbers are coming out. They're unhelpfully rather similar. Yeah. They're actually shaped differently and they're sort of informed differently, right? So it's about 718 million in the dynamic infrastructure pipeline at the moment, but that's not the same as the 725. I think there's something here about the fact we've made it iterative. So the reason we've given ourselves 6 months or so to keep refreshing it is because we are getting better, I think, at the detail that's needed by industry, but it does have to be a two-way dialogue. Yeah. This data didn't actually exist in a form we needed to be able to bring it together. It is increasingly better. The other thing is we always set quite a high bar for what could get into the pipeline. So as I say, it's rather a different animal from the strategy. And the reason we set a high bar is because we don't want to put things in that aren't committed.
Yes. Yeah.
The reason being, we are asking industry to come with us. We're asking them to make investments in skills and innovations, right? The quid pro quo is I am having to have conversations with government about how committed things are and that they need to remain so. Yeah.
Well, that was a point that was made in the latest huddle that I was involved in with James Murray, who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury then, about this point of they have to be proper projects. They have to be real projects before they go in there. Are you getting feedback from the industry which is appreciating that then?
We've actually had, I'm humbled to say, and I have to say, credit to the fantastic team under Ria Roby, who leads this in the organisation, clearly not my work, right? But we've had some excellent feedback from industry, and, I'll permit myself a bit of an ask, I suppose, because getting that feedback, be it constructive or positive, is hugely important to us because it strengthens the view of ministers as well, that this is the right thing to do. So really good positive feedback, but we know there's work to do. It's not granular enough. We haven't quite been able to cut the data in certain ways that give enough. So that's why it's still iterative. Yeah. We haven't finalised it.
I suppose which leads me to NISTA, and just over a year in with NISTA, what are the internal cultural barriers that you've had to break down to ensure that high level policy strategy actually speaks to the nitty-gritty realities of day-to-day project assurance and making sure that those pipelines mean something to the industry?
I think it's been really positive to have some sort of case studies, if you will. Do you know what I mean? I think a lot of us sort of learn by do in our industry, and things like the Northern Growth Strategy being published over our first year was a really, really powerful way to bring our policy and strategy people in, to bring to life that sort of spatial planning theory with lots of our delivery colleagues who'd already been working on a number of, say, Northern Powerhouse projects, right? So bringing that together around something that was about to go out and using shared positions to give that advice into Treasury ministers. So that's been a really good advantage. The other thing is what I hear back from the team is it's a light bulb moment, right? You suddenly think, if we're making these strategic connections, they're really useful. The other thing is we've had some great conversations about things like new towns and how work like our social infrastructure roadmap needs to come to life, right? We mustn't forget that infrastructure comes in many forms, right? I'm lucky I have a huge brief, defence is in there, service transformation is critical to frontline services for people. But economic and social infrastructure need to come together around place-based answers. So a lot of the team, I think, have been, I hope, really interested and excited by the fact that we can actually draw in all this delivery knowledge across different elements of these different sectors to then have a quite holistic outcome.
Yeah, of course, if you look at housing is pointless unless you build the infrastructure that makes it all happen
People
around
need to
there.
want to live there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which brings me to, I suppose, you've moved on from the IPA approach. So how do you see that NISTA methodology is genuinely different from the one that was used by IPA?
I think we have a different set of opportunities as NISTA. I think IPA's methodology is fantastic and it's something we want to build on. You've mentioned transforming infrastructure performance. We're very keen not to discard or look away from the great work of the past. I think what's different is our remit is actually quite different. So, for example, the National Infrastructure Commission did great work. They didn't have social infrastructure in their remit at all. They assessed economic infrastructure need. We're now building our social infrastructure roadmap to fill that gap, to have that needs understanding, right? Infrastructure and Projects Authority was largely looking at a grouping of projects that were at least nascently coming to life already, right? It wasn't necessarily possible to have a look at that strategic set of challenges like transmission, connections, other things like that. So that holistic set of needs that lots of my delivery colleagues always know are there. I mean, which of us hasn't had a long conversation about utilities, right? I think we've always known that this was present, but actually as a single remit, you can start to bring that to life in a different way. And I'm really hopeful that lots of my colleagues can see that too. I think that's the sense around NISTA now.
Yeah, so nuclear power stations are great, but if you can't get the power to where it's needed in housing, then it's pointless.
It doesn't deliver. It doesn't deliver for the people it's intended for, right? And that does ignite my people. I think we all come together around that.
Yeah. As looking forward then, I mean, you mentioned the role of data and digital tools and certainly the aligned spatial planning tool. You're also championing a new AI-powered early warning system. I mean, what do you hope these tools will enable you to do then?
Well, we talked a little bit about the fact that I don't think Reset is a sort of withdrawal of support. It's a different set of targeting, I suppose, but it's also a recognition that accountable officers are always going to need lots of intelligence and data around what they're doing to do their jobs well, right? So early warning system is a good example of our AI outputs. We're also running a couple of other things which I don't think I'm allowed to name because they're still in beta, but looking at things that you'd expect, right? The sort of thematic learning that we've got across huge amounts of textual content and great lessons learning reports, and bringing that to bear in terms of thematic understanding, analysing data and inputs that we've got on different projects to sort of understand what's coming up thematically and how we can help better. And I think that should help the departments as well. We're also doing a little bit of thought around supplier networks, so thinking about how those come to life and what that means across the government's portfolio.
Which I suppose leads you to the question of how clean and reliable the underlying departmental data feeding these machines is.
Thank you for mentioning the government data standard, right?
But is it as good as it needs to be?
I think it's been really interesting for us actually starting to build these things and bringing them to life, right? So I don't think it's quite there yet. If I'm going to be balanced about this, I was delighted to see the publication of our government project delivery data standard, because part of that's about how we buy data in a cleaner way, how we create data in a cleaner way. The other observation I would make, though, is a lot of the work that we're doing, say, for example, on things like asset management plans, so looking across AMP8, drawing content into a line, for example, our spatial planning tool, and understanding infrastructure needs and gaps from a digital data way. You can do a great deal with AI if intelligently and cautiously done, which begins to help us with the fact that we're not still in a world, I don't think, technologically, that it must be in a certain way with a certain naming convention. There are things that we can do with our data intelligently. That means we can build this faster.
Yeah. Can AI genuinely predict human and political delivery failure then?
I suspect it requires a great deal of human intervention, right? And the trick is in the prompt, no?
Yeah, well, quite, yes.
So there's quite a bit of thinking that we're doing about those prompts, actually, and how we prompt it, but also the way it's learning is throwing things out. And I don't think we can look away from the fact that you have to look at that data with care. Yeah,
I suppose it goes to politicians. It depends what question you ask them, doesn't it?
Well, indeed, it's all about the prompt.
Finally then, measures of success. I mean, you stated that NISTA will ultimately be judged not by its own processes and publications, but by whether government projects are better planned, governed and delivered. So when the next annual report is published in next July, I mean, what are the hard, non-negotiable target metrics that for you will prove NISTA is succeeding?
I think an ongoing commitment to transparency, actually not to be naff about it at all, but we've got to keep this journey, right? We've got to keep talking about things that are problematic as well as talking about things that are going well. I think I'd like to see us really having got into the detail on some of that governance, accountability and assurance work being done as robustly, but also as intelligently as it can be. That's a big sea change. I think we should recognise it, and I think we need to be holding ourselves to account as to whether we've done that. And some of that is behavioural, some of that's cultural in terms of how we're leading this well. I'd also like to understand and see, I think, from all of us, that we are increasingly confident we understand exactly what the right interventions are, right? It's one thing to understand a sort of high-level assessment of where a project status might feel like. It's another thing, I think, to have been really strong with ourselves about what are the mitigations, what are the interventions, and being able to pull the lever to take them. Okay. And that, we're in a fantastic position to work across government. Pulling some of those levers is a new thing for this organisation and for the way that government's working. So being able to have done that effectively in really quite a few places and made change, unlocked things, created a better path for delivery, I think is a big outcome for us. I think the other thing is maintaining the interest and investment from people wanting to work in government projects, right? Mm-hmm. I'm the head of the function. It's a great privilege and a gift. I see across the project delivery profession us doing incredibly fascinating things, but keeping that drumbeat of attracting talent and building relationships with industry in the way we've described, that I think is another thing we need to be holding ourselves to account on.
And making sure that those people within your teams here and in those departmental teams have the skills that are needed to keep those projects on track.
That expertise, exactly, and that pipeline of talent.
Yeah. Finally, then, as I say, we're sitting here today in your office just around the corner, in the Treasury, just around the corner from Downing Street, hence the helicopters flying
and
over.
And across the road from ICU, right?
And across the road from ICU, of course, yes. I mentioned the change in government on the horizon. What is your ask then of the Andy Burnham administration to help keep infrastructure delivery on track and to help NISTA deliver on its objectives?
Well, I've been really fortunate. The Chief Secretaries of the Treasury I've worked with closely since I took the job have all been hugely invested and sort of bought into the importance of infrastructure as part of growth, as part of contributing to driving economic growth, but also as part of the way that we're going to build a UK for the future that people are going to thrive in, right? So I'm really hoping that that's a continuity factor for me. I think the fact that we're asking for a long-term set of commitments and maintaining long-term confidence is a huge ask, actually, of any political person in terms of the way that the term works. So my conversation with them about that long-term case and why it matters, particularly for our sector, that we do look across the long term, that's going to be part of the conversation. And then I think the third thing is maintaining that focus on skills and capability. How do we do that across the piece? How do we make this a great industry to work in, make those pathways work externally, but also keep that expertise ready and live in government to do this really well? We have to be great clients.
Great, yeah. Well, you've had 3 Chief Secretaries of the Treasury, I think, already. So, maybe there's another one coming around the corner. Who knows? But the message that you put out there is very clear. So, Becky, thanks so much for joining me today, for explaining how you see the NISTA's vision, but also how you see the industry working very closely with you to help us to deliver this huge and very ambitious infrastructure pipeline. So, thanks for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. But sadly, that's all we've got time for on the podcast now. But there is more in the pipeline as we continue to probe the big issues facing the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Becky. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.